She belongs to us now, old man. I will kill anyone who comes near her.
The sun hung low over the dry, endless plains, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. Dust rose in lazy swirls from the hooves of the lone rider moving steadily toward the small cluster of buildings that made up the town of Red Willow. From a distance he looked like any other man on the trail, but anyone who knew the land could tell he carried the strength of the mountains and the silent weight of experience in his eyes. His name was Dakota, a warrior of the Apache, known for his fierce skill in combat and the unbending code he lived by. To him, life was measured in survival, loyalty, and the quiet promise he made to protect those who could not protect themselves. And now, the path ahead carried the heaviest responsibility he had ever faced. The town lay eerily quiet, the kind of silence that whispered of trouble before it arrived. Word had reached Dakota days ago about a gang of outlaws moving through the region, a ruthless bunch who left no trail of mercy in their wake. Their targets were anyone who stood in the way of easy money or a violent thrill, and Red Willow had become their next mark. Dakota's horse snorted nervously, its ears twitching as though it could sense the tension thickening the air. His hand hovered near the bough strapped to his back, his fingers brushing against the worn wood, ready to strike if the moment demanded. He entered the town just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows that twisted along the wooden buildings and empty streets. The faint smell of smoke lingered, a warning sign that someone had already tested the nerves of Red Willow's few residents. Dakota's gaze swept across the streets, sharp and steady, noting the signs of fear etched into the faces peeking from behind doors and shutters. And then he saw her. She was standing near the well, her frame slender and her posture tense, as if the world had grown heavy on her shoulders overnight. Her hair caught the last light of the day, a soft shimmer that seemed almost out of place against the harshness of the town. She was young, far too young for the hardships she had endured, and her eyes carried the kind of sadness that only comes from a life interrupted too soon. Dakota recognized immediately that she was the widow the townsfolk had whispered about, the one who had lost her husband to a cruel twist of fate, leaving her alone and vulnerable. But vulnerability was not weakness, and he knew that just by the way she held herself. Dakota approached slowly, boots crunching over the dry earth, and tipped his head in a respectful nod. "You must be the widow they call Ilara," he said, his voice steady and low, carrying authority without cruelty. She flinched at first, wary of strangers, but something in the calm firmness of his stance made her relax ever so slightly. "I've been sent to keep you safe," he continued, "until the danger passes." Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear mixed with relief crossing her face. "They say the gang won't leave anyone alive," she whispered, her voice trembling as though speaking it too loudly might summon them from the shadows. "I don't know why they would come for me." "I've done nothing to them." Dakota studied her closely, sensing the quiet courage beneath her fragile appearance. "Danger doesn't always need a reason," he said. "It just comes. But it will not find you while I'm here." He gestured toward the street behind them, dark and empty except for the whisper of wind. "We move carefully from here. One wrong step, and it could be the last." As the two of them made their way toward the boarded-up inn where she had taken refuge, Dakota noticed small details that spoke of her life in hiding. The locks were reinforced with extra chains, a bucket of water sat near the door for emergencies, and a rifle rested in the corner, well-oiled but never fired. She was careful, but fear had a way of clouding judgment. And while she had prepared for defense, she had no idea what true danger looked like until it would step out from the darkness and confront her. That evening, the town fell into a tense hush. Dakota took position near the main street, keeping his ears attuned to the faintest creak of wood or rustle of fabric. Ilara sat inside the inn, watching the fading light through the cracks in the shutters, clutching a worn locket that had belonged to her husband. She had never known a life without constant caution, yet something about Dakota's presence stirred a feeling she hadn't felt since she became a widow hope, fragile and flickering. The first signs of the gang arrived like shadows themselves, slipping along the edges of the town with the precision of predators. Dakota's eyes narrowed. They were not just common bandits. These men were disciplined, skilled, and cruel. He had seen their work before. There would be no mercy, no hesitation, and no warning until the violence was already done. He had sworn to protect this woman, and nothing, not even the night or the odds stacked against him, would make him break that vow. Hours passed, each moment thick with anticipation. The wind carried sounds of distant hoofbeats, whispers of movement, and the occasional clink of metal that made Tekoda's jaw tighten. He moved silently outside, checking the perimeter, ensuring that every possible entrance was watched. The shadows themselves seemed to watch him back, stretching long and sharp across the worn wood of the buildings. And in the inn, Alara felt the weight of each passing minute, her heartbeat rising as though it could announce the gang's approach before they even arrived. By midnight, the first sign of trouble came, a faint footfall on the roof above the inn, barely audible over the wind. Tekoda's hand tightened on the hilt of his knife, ready for the leap if needed. Alara froze, realizing the danger was closer than she had imagined. She wanted to move, to run, but Tekoda's steady presence kept her rooted in place. The sound of a shattering shutter made them both tense. The gang had arrived. Tekoda stepped forward, positioning himself between the door and Alara. He had faced outlaws before, in skirmishes across the plains and on distant trails, but this felt different. The stakes were personal now. The safety of this gentle, resilient widow rested on his skill, his judgment, and the sharpness of his senses. One wrong move and everything could fall apart. As the first shadow detached itself from the darkened street, Tekoda's eyes met Alara's. She could see the calm determination there, a warrior who had survived countless battles and would survive many more. And in that glance, something shifted inside her, a recognition that even in the face of overwhelming danger, she was not alone. Fear still gripped her, but alongside it, an unfamiliar sense of trust began to grow. The wind carried a faint, metallic scent, and Tekoda's instincts screamed at him to act before the gang could strike. He moved swiftly, pulling Alara to the side, positioning her behind a solid wooden beam as the first outlaw stepped onto the porch. Tekoda's bow was ready, his arrow poised. Every muscle coiled with the precision of someone who had lived every day prepared for the worst. The gang's leader, a broad man with a cruel smirk, glanced around the empty street, unaware that his quarry was already defended by someone who would not hesitate to protect her. Alara's breath came fast, the sound sharp in the tense air, but she felt the strange comfort of Tekoda's presence. She had spent so long in fear that she had forgotten what it felt like to trust another human being completely. And now, as the first arrow flew silently through the night, she realized that her life and perhaps something deeper than survival had become intertwined with this tough Apache who had sworn to protect her. The skirmish outside promised a long, brutal night. Shadows darted, footsteps echoed, and the faint glint of metal told of weapons ready to strike. Tekoda remained a calm storm at the center of it, each movement deliberate, every sense alert. Alara clutched the locket tighter, feeling the pulse of danger vibrating through the wooden walls around her. And then, as the first echo of a shout tore through the night, a sound that could mean either victory or death, Tekoda's eyes narrowed. Somewhere in the darkness, a figure was moving, not like the others, not like anyone he had seen before. It was deliberate, calculated, and terrifying in its patience. The night held its breath, and so did Alara. The next moments would define them both, the widow and the warrior, the gentle heart and the fierce protector. Tekoda had faced countless threats in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about loyalty, courage, and the fragile, dangerous stirrings of something that neither had expected to feel. And as the first strike fell from the darkness, the town of Red Willow became a battlefield where every heartbeat could be the last, and every choice could mean life or death. Tekoda moved like a shadow himself, but in the back of his mind, he could not ignore the thought that haunted him even as he fought to keep her safe. What if protecting her meant more than just keeping the gang at bay? The wind shifted, carrying a new sound, a laugh, low and chilling, that promised the fight was far from over. Alara's eyes widened and Tekoda's jaw clenched. The night was only beginning, and with it, a story of danger, courage, and a connection neither of them had dared to name would unfold. They had survived so far, but the real test was yet to come, and neither knew what lay beyond the shadows waiting to strike. The cliff of uncertainty loomed, and with a glance at the horizon, Dakota realized that the night held more than just outlaws, it held choices that could bind them together, or tear them apart before the first light of dawn. The darkness pressed closer, and the sound of boots on the wooden porch warned that the gang had found them. Ilara's hand trembled, but Dakota's steady presence gave her the courage to face what was coming. He had vowed to protect her, and nothing, not even the unknown horrors moving toward them, would make him falter. And yet, even as the first shot rang out, he could not shake the feeling that something else, something more dangerous than any gang was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The night of Red Willow had begun, and with it, the story of a tough Apache and a gentle widow whose lives were about to change forever. The night air hung heavy with tension as Dakota moved swiftly along the shadows of Red Willow, each step measured, each breath controlled. The sound of boots from the gang outside echoed faintly over the wooden boards, a rhythm that carried both threat and promise of violence. His eyes flicked constantly, scanning for movement, calculating each possibility. He had fought countless battles in the deserts, forests, and canyons of the West, yet this town held a different kind of danger. Here, he was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Ilara, a woman whose life and fragile courage now rested entirely on his vigilance. Ilara crouched behind the thick wooden beam of the inn's porch, gripping her husband's locket as if it were an anchor against the rising tide of fear. She had never imagined that the day would come when a stranger powerful, silent, and watchful would become her protector. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the man she had lost, the one who had promised her a quiet life in Red Willow before fate had torn him away. She swallowed the lump in her throat, determined not to cry. There was no time for weakness, not with the shadows that now crept closer to the inn. Dakota crouched low, listening. The gang had been moving with precision, almost as if they had studied the town beforehand. He could hear the soft scrape of leather, the occasional whisper, the faint metallic rattle that told him the outlaws were armed and ready. One wrong sound from either him or them could spark a deadly clash. He moved silently, every muscle coiled like a spring, as he scanned the dark street for the leader. He had learned to recognize patterns in outlaws, the way the bold moved first and the cautious followed, and his instincts told him the gang's headman was near, watching, waiting to see if anyone dared oppose him. Ilara's heart pounded as a shadow passed the inn's doorway. She thought she saw a figure pause, hear a laugh that was low, harsh, and cruel. Her breath caught as she pressed herself closer to the wall. Dakota's voice was calm but firm, a lifeline in the dark. "Stay quiet, don't move unless I tell you. Remember, your safety is my priority." She nodded, silently grateful, though fear still gripped her tightly. The presence of this warrior made her feel both safe and acutely aware of the danger surrounding them. As Dakota observed the street, his mind wandered briefly, recalling how he had come to Red Willow in the first place. He had been tracking this gang for weeks, following the trail of destruction they left behind from town to town. There was no honor in their violence, no reason other than greed and cruelty. And then he had heard the name of the widow who had lost her husband, a man who had once crossed paths with Dakota years ago in the Northern Territories. Her tragedy had reached him not only because of justice, but because he understood what it meant to lose someone to the unforgiving hand of fate. He had sworn to prevent another loss, and that oath burned in him stronger than any other. The gang moved cautiously now, their approach deliberate. Dakota could hear the soft scuff of boots on dirt and wood, the faint scrape of tools and weapons, but still he sensed something more. The leader of the gang had a confidence, a presence that made the night feel heavier. Dakota had faced men like this before, outlaws who thrived on fear, who calculated their moves with cold precision, but this one felt different. There was a cruel intelligence in the way he moved, a sharpness to his attention that meant he was not just here for plunder. He had a reason, and Dakota needed to find it before the gang struck. Inside the inn, Ilara tried to steady her breathing. Her thoughts flickered to the life she had known before the tragedy, to the quiet moments she had shared with her husband by the creek, the laughter and the promise of a future that had been ripped away. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rhythm of her heart, trying to focus not on fear but on survival. She had learned quickly how to adapt, how to observe, how to move silently, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of this night. Dakota's presence reminded her that there was strength in others, and yet, In that same thought, she realized how fragile life could be. Tekoda shifted his position slightly, catching movement at the far end of the street. The gang was probing the town, testing for weaknesses, but they had not yet discovered the inn. That was fortunate, but he knew the calm would not last. Outlaws like these rarely acted alone. They tested, they waited, they struck suddenly. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every faint sound could be the precursor to violence. He silently thanked the training of his people, the lessons learned from years of survival, as his eyes never left the dark corners of the town. He recalled, too, the history of Red Willow, a town that had survived harsh winters, droughts, and raids. The townsfolk were cautious, quiet, and weary. They had learned the rhythm of survival, and their respect for Tekoda grew even in his brief presence. They had seen his skill, his careful watch, and the calm determination that suggested he would not allow fear to dictate their fate. Yet, even with their silent approval, he knew that one misstep from the gang could undo all he had prepared for. Ilara's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a scraping at the window. So soft it could have been the wind, yet her instincts told her otherwise. She froze, her hand trembling slightly on the locket. Tekoda moved to the source in a smooth motion, his body almost invisible in the darkness. He pressed his ear to the window and listened, then shook his head subtly. "They're testing," he said, "trying to see if we react." "Stay calm," she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The night seemed endless, yet within it moments of clarity appeared. Tekoda caught small details about Ilara as they moved through the inn. She was cautious, yes, but not cowardly. She listened, observed, and reacted, showing intelligence and resourcefulness. It was rare to see someone so gentle yet so strong, and even he could not deny that her presence had stirred something in him beyond duty. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The gang was patient, and patience in their kind often led to violence. Outside, the wind carried faint whispers from the approaching outlaws. Tekoda could hear the soft swish of fabric and the shuffle of boots, movements designed to intimidate and unsettle. He crouched, ready, his senses attuned to every nuance. He knew their methods, their habits, and their likely targets. One wrong sound, one flicker of light, and the situation could spiral into chaos. His mind raced with strategies, fallback positions, and contingencies, all while keeping Ilara safe within the inn. As the night wore on, he allowed himself brief flashes of thought about the widow's life. He wondered how she had survived so long alone, how she had carried her grief with quiet strength, and how she would respond if he could not be there to protect her. It was a dangerous path, allowing his mind to wander in such a way, but even a warrior carried humanity within him, and he could not deny that the thought of losing her to the gang filled him with a silent urgency. Ilara, too, felt the tension in new ways. She had survived fear before, but never the kind of calculated, watching danger that Tekoda represented to her life. He was a shield, yes, but also a reminder of what was at stake. She tried to quiet her thoughts, to focus on survival, but even as she did, the faint spark of trust, admiration, and something more flickered within her. It was unsettling, confusing, yet in that fire of emotion she found a sense of courage she had not felt in months. The gang tested the town relentlessly, moving from building to building, their movements deliberate yet cautious. Tekoda countered each approach with precision, ensuring that the widow remained unseen, unheard, and untouched. His experience told him that outlaws thrived on fear and distraction, and he used their own tactics against them, guiding their attention away from the inn while keeping Ilara safely within its walls. Every step was calculated, every decision weighed, because the night's outcome could not be left to chance. Hours passed, and the first signs of dawn appeared faintly on the horizon. The gang had not yet discovered the inn, but Tekoda knew their patience would not last forever. Outlaws were relentless, and when cornered, they struck with unpredictability. He adjusted his position, scanning the edges of the town, listening to every whisper, every shift of movement, every subtle sound. The stakes had never been higher. Ilara watched him, realizing that her fate now intertwined with his skill, his courage, and his unwavering determination. He had taken on a duty that was not his burden by necessity, yet he carried it as if it were a sacred obligation. And in that quiet realization she felt a spark of hope, a hope that perhaps, against all odds, she would survive this night, and perhaps even see the light of a future beyond fear. But the wind shifted, carrying a new sound, sharp and deliberate. Dakota froze, his hand hovering near his weapon. Ilara felt the change in the air immediately. Something had moved differently, something that spoke of intent, intelligence, and danger unlike before. Dakota's eyes narrowed. The gang was not finished. There was a new element now, a threat that he had not yet accounted for, and the realization made his jaw tighten. Ilara's hand clutched the locket tighter as the first shadow detached itself from the edge of the inn, moving with a purpose that made her heart pound. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but Dakota's presence anchored her. He was ready. He would face this threat. But even as he readied himself, the tension of the night seemed to multiply, and both of them understood without speaking that the danger was far from over. The night had already tested them, revealed their courage, and forged a fragile trust between them. Yet, with the shadow now moving closer, a sense of uncertainty hung over Red Willow, thick as the smoke from long-extinguished fires. Dakota's eyes scanned the approaching figure, his instincts screaming that this was more than a simple outlaw. It was something calculated, patient, and dangerous. And as he readied for the inevitable confrontation, he could not shake the thought that this encounter might change everything, not just the outcome of the night, but the future of the widow he had sworn to protect. The first shot rang out from somewhere deeper in the darkness, and Dakota leapt into action, pulling Ilara down behind the sturdy beam of the inn's porch. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, but the warmth of his presence reminded her that she was not alone. The fight was far from over, and the night still held secrets neither of them were prepared to face. In the shadows, the unknown watcher paused, calculating the next move as Dakota's eyes narrowed, unblinking. The night had begun its long, dangerous game, and neither Red Willow nor its inhabitants would emerge unscathed. The first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the wooden boards of the inn, painting long, sharp streaks across the dusty floor. Outside, Red Willow seemed almost peaceful, but the calm was deceptive. Dakota's senses remained taut, every muscle coiled for movement. The shadows had shifted with the night, leaving footprints, whispers, and traces of the gang's presence. He moved silently along the edge of the building, eyes scanning the street for the faintest sign of motion. The outlaws were clever. They had tested the town relentlessly, probing for weaknesses, and now they were regrouping for the next strike. Inside the inn, Ilara clutched her locket and sat close to the window, peeking through the cracks. She could see the faint outline of figures moving between buildings. Each shadow made her stomach tighten. Fear had been her constant companion since the death of her husband, yet in Dakota's presence it felt manageable, almost bearable. She had survived alone before, but now, with someone trained, focused, and willing to defend her, she could imagine a moment where survival was not just a struggle, but a chance to fight back. Dakota moved to the corner, listening. His instincts told him that the gang was not acting randomly, they had a plan. He crouched low, noting patterns, the spacing of their movements, the way the leader seemed to observe rather than act. That calculated observation was what worried him most. He had faced outlaws before, violent men who relied on brute force, but this one thought ahead. This one had strategy. He paused, considering what he knew of the gang's previous raids in nearby settlements. They were skilled at intimidation, manipulating fear, and breaking the spirit of anyone in their path. Red Willow was not just a target. It was a challenge, and they thrived on those. Ilara noticed Dakota pause, his body frozen like a predator waiting to strike. She followed his gaze and caught sight of a shadow slipping across the street, moving closer to the inn. Her hand tightened around the locket. "Do you see them?" she whispered. Dakota shook his head slowly, not breaking his stance. "Not yet," he said, "but they are near. Watch the shadows, listen to the wind. Anything out of place will tell us more than words." She nodded, silently acknowledging the training he offered in those few quiet instructions. It was strange how swiftly trust had formed between them, born not from familiarity, but from necessity. Outside, the gang's leader studied the town from a vantage point atop a low hill, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He was broad-shouldered, with a hard face that had seen decades of harsh living. His men moved like shadows, whispering, circling, probing. The leader's gaze lingered on the inn, where he suspected the widow might be hiding. He knew she carried something valuable, a connection to her late husband, perhaps, or secrets of the town's defenses. Whatever it was, it had made her a target. He smiled faintly, a cruel twitch at the corner of his mouth, and signaled to 2 men to test the door. The sound was faint, the scrape of wood against wood, but it was enough to draw Dakota's attention immediately. He crouched lower, moving silently to intercept. His hand rested on the bow, arrow nocked and ready. He had faced this kind of test before, and he knew the value of patience. The gang would continue their probing, but they were predictable if he watched closely enough. His experience told him to let them make the first move, to strike when advantage was his. Inside, Alara's fingers trembled slightly as she shifted, her eyes wide. She had spent nights fearing intruders, but this was different. The presence of Dakota, steady and unflinching, gave her courage. She understood instinctively that the night was far from over, that the danger was growing with each passing moment. And she felt a curious stir of emotion, a mix of admiration, fear, and something she could not name. Dakota's resolve was magnetic, though she knew better than to let emotion cloud the reality of their situation. The gang outside grew bolder, testing multiple entrances, whispering instructions to each other in low voices. Dakota's sharp ears picked up every nuance. He could tell the leader's men were skilled in coordination, and he realized that this attack was as much psychological as physical. They wanted to intimidate, to wear down confidence, to force mistakes. And they had underestimated Dakota's patience, his ability to observe and anticipate. He moved silently along the edge of the building, adjusting his stance to remain unseen. The sun continued to rise, casting long lines of light that created false shadows and potential hiding spots. Dakota had to account for every possibility. He counted men, assessed positions, and tracked movement, all while keeping Alara safely inside. Each moment stretched tension tighter around them like a rope ready to snap. Alara shifted her position, noticing Dakota's eyes flick toward the far corner of the street. She followed his gaze and saw a figure ducking behind a barrel. Her stomach tightened. "They're everywhere," she whispered. Dakota's jaw tightened. "They are organized," he said. "Not mindless. Watch and learn." He moved closer to the window, peeking through a gap just enough to observe without exposing himself. The gang's methodical approach was clear now. They intended to surround the inn, cut off escape, and force her into submission. That they had not yet discovered the inn was a testament to his own skill, but the clock was ticking. Patience had limits, and outlaws had the habit of becoming reckless when frustrated. He thought briefly of the woman he was protecting. Her strength surprised him, not because of skill, but because of endurance. She had faced loss, fear, and isolation, yet her courage remained, subtle and quiet. He respected that. It made his resolve to defend her even stronger. He realized that the danger of the gang was not only physical, it was emotional, and protecting her meant guarding against despair as much as against bullets. Meanwhile, the gang's leader signaled silently to a few men, directing them to test the windows on the side of the building. The scrape of metal and the faint rattle of chains echoed, but Dakota's keen observation and rapid movements prevented them from seeing any sign of life inside. He shifted again, adjusting angles, noting every footstep, every glance, every flicker of motion. Alara felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. She had survived alone, hiding in towns and on trails, yet she had never encountered someone like Dakota. His skill was not just in weapons or speed, it was in awareness, anticipation, and the careful choreography of defense. And she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a sense that perhaps he would not only protect her life but help her face the fear she had carried for too long. As the sun rose higher, a new element arrived on the edges of Red Willow. A stranger, riding cautiously, paused on the outskirts of the town. Dakota noticed immediately, observing the tension in the rider's posture, the subtle way the horse shifted its weight. This was not part of the gang, this was an unknown factor. He tensed, realizing that the night's danger had new dimensions. He could not predict loyalty or intent from the stranger, only watch carefully and be ready to act. Inside the inn, Alara noticed Dakota's brief glance toward the approaching rider. She followed his gaze and tensed. "Another threat?" she whispered. Dakota shook his head. "Unknown," he said. But we cannot ignore it. Watch closely. She nodded, learning that vigilance was now part of her life. She had survived fear before, but never this intricate, layered, and immediate. The gang outside grew restless. Their leader signaled again, gesturing toward a back alley that could allow them to flank the inn. Tekoda's mind raced, considering how to counter each move, protect Ilara, and anticipate the unknown rider. Every second was precious, every breath a potential turning point. The stakes had never been higher. Ilara's thoughts wandered to the life she had left behind, to her husband, to the home they had tried to build, and to the future that now seemed fragile and uncertain. She felt the strange pull of hope mingled with fear, and she realized that her heart was no longer hers alone. Tekoda's presence had changed the rhythm of her thoughts, his steady vigilance a mirror of the resilience she had buried deep inside herself. Tekoda crouched at the edge of the inn, bow knocked and eyes scanning, while Ilara observed quietly from the shadows. The unknown rider paused at the outskirts, observing the scene like a hawk. The gang continued its probing, unaware of Tekoda's careful watch, unaware that the widow they sought was far from defenseless. The town of Red Willow held its breath, and the day had barely begun. The tension between life and death, fear and courage, trust and doubt, threaded every movement. Tekoda's mind moved through possibilities and strategies, predicting outcomes, measuring risk, while Ilara absorbed lessons in awareness and courage. Both knew that the real fight had not yet arrived, that the conflict was growing, and that every step, every glance, and every breath would count in the hours to come. And in that moment, as the sun climbed higher, the first signs of the gang's impatience became visible. They moved more aggressively, testing the inn's defenses, their frustration growing. Tekoda remained calm but alert, aware that one wrong choice could endanger not only the widow, but the fragile balance of the town itself. The stranger on the outskirts remained, watching, waiting, and neither Tekoda nor Ilara could yet determine intent. The tension deepened, the unknown layered on top of the known threat. Red Willow had become a chessboard of survival, strategy, and hidden danger. The night had passed, but the day promised new threats, new challenges, and decisions that could change everything. Ilara realized with a quiet certainty that the fight for survival was no longer just about hiding or escaping. It was about understanding, watching, learning, and trusting in the one man who had placed himself in danger for her sake. Tekoda, the Apache warrior, had become her shield, her teacher, and perhaps something more, though neither would admit it aloud. And as the first sounds of confrontation echoed through the town, the unknown rider made a move that could alter everything. The gang's impatience brought them closer, and Tekoda prepared for a day of conflict that would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage they both possessed. Red Willow held its breath, the shadows shifted, and the story of the tough Apache and the gentle widow moved into its next uncertain chapter. The sun rose higher, casting a harsh light over the town of Red Willow, but the brightness did little to ease the tension that gripped its streets. Shadows clung to corners and alleys like living things, hiding men who had already learned fear in the faces of those they sought to dominate. Tekoda crouched behind a stack of crates near the inn, bow ready, eyes flicking from one corner to another. Every sound carried meaning, the scrape of leather, the faint whisper of a boot, the distant murmur of voices trying to coordinate an attack. He had anticipated much, but even he could feel the pulse of danger thrum stronger now than it had all night. Ilara remained inside, her hands trembling slightly as she checked the locks again, ensuring every barrier was secure. She had followed Tekoda's instructions, moved with caution, and learned quickly from his vigilant presence. Yet fear lingered, and she could not help imagining what might happen if the gang discovered her hiding place. Each sound made her heart spike, each shadow seemed to inch closer. Despite it, she felt a strange thrill at the danger, the kind that comes from knowing someone capable stood between her and certain harm. It was a feeling she had long denied herself, one she both feared and welcomed. From the edge of town, the gang had begun to reorganize, their leader stepping forward with sharp, calculated gestures. Tekoda had already noted his pattern. The men were aggressive but methodical, circling and probing, waiting for a moment of weakness. They had underestimated the strength of the woman he protected and the vigilance he maintained. Still, he knew patience would only last so long. Their leader's eyes gleamed with a cruel promise, and Dakota understood that when the first real strike came, it would be swift and unrelenting. He moved carefully, positioning himself to intercept anyone approaching from the east side of the street, the path the gang was likely to use to flank the inn. His breathing was steady, but inside, adrenaline surged, keeping his senses razor-sharp. He had faced countless threats before, but there was something personal about this one. The woman he had sworn to protect was not just a life to save. She had stirred something he had long tried to ignore, something beyond duty. He shook the thought away, focusing instead on the practical reality. If he failed, she would die, and the town would fall into chaos. Ilara peeked through a narrow gap in the boards covering the window. The gang's men were moving closer, their shadows stretching across the street, their whispers carrying a cruel undercurrent. She swallowed hard, gripping the locket tighter. She had survived fear before, but this was different. The knowledge that Dakota was out there, preparing to strike at any second, gave her courage, but it did not erase the terror. Her thoughts flickered to her husband, to the life she had once imagined, and to the uncertain path ahead. She felt a strange mix of grief, hope, and anticipation that left her chest tight and her mind restless. Dakota caught movement at the far edge of the street, a subtle shift in posture that spoke of the gang's impatience. One of their men had broken formation slightly, stepping closer than instructed. It was a small mistake, but it could be deadly. Dakota adjusted his position, knocking an arrow with precision. His eyes locked onto the figure, calculating the distance, the angle, and the timing. Every second mattered now. The town could not afford hesitation. At that same moment, the stranger at the outskirts of Red Willow moved closer. Dakota noticed immediately, his instincts signaling that this was no ordinary passerby. The rider's intent was unclear, yet deliberate. He could be an ally, or he could be another threat. Dakota had no time to guess. He had to focus on the immediate danger first. Still, the tension of unknown variables layered over the known threat made his pulse quicken. Every detail mattered: the wind, the sun's glare, the shadows, and the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of motion. Inside the inn, Ilara's thoughts spun in unsteady circles. She had lived with loss, fear, and isolation, but never with the immediacy of life hanging by a thread. Dakota's quiet, commanding presence anchored her, yet she felt a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken, growing in the spaces between fear and trust. She realized that the night, the threat, and the strange intimacy of reliance had begun to stir emotions she had long kept buried. Her fingers tightened on the locket, not just for comfort, but as a reminder of the life she had survived and the unknown future that now beckoned. The gang's leader had grown impatient. He signaled a coordinated move, sending 2 men to circle the inn while another approached from the rear. Dakota anticipated it, adjusting his stance, preparing for confrontation. His eyes flicked to the windows, noting every crack and shadow, calculating angles of defense and potential lines of attack. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what was coming. The gang's aggression had grown bolder with each hour, and the first strike would not be their last. Suddenly, the sound of a horse's hooves struck the edge of Dakota's awareness. The stranger had entered town, riding cautiously but with purpose. Dakota's instincts screamed caution. He could not yet trust this rider, yet he also knew that the dynamics of the fight would change with a new factor present. Every second now carried weight. Every breath, every glance, every movement could shift the balance of survival. Ilara tensed, peeking through the window as the stranger dismounted near the outskirts. Dakota had not moved yet, but his eyes were fixed, studying the figure. The stranger was not part of the gang, but their intent was unknown. Ilara felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The fight for survival had grown more complex, and she realized that her understanding of danger was expanding with each passing moment. The gang moved closer to the inn, their frustration evident in sharp gestures and murmured instructions. Dakota anticipated their next move, preparing to counter, deflect, and protect. The first of them reached a corner, pausing briefly, and Dakota's arrow flew silently, striking the ground near the man to unnerve and redirect him. Fear and confusion rippled through the gang's ranks, yet their leader's eyes blazed with a cruel determination. He would not be deterred easily. Ilara felt her pulse quicken as the arrow struck. It was the first active engagement she had witnessed, and the sudden display of skill and control by Dakota left her both awed and frightened. She realized the danger was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, tangible, and deadly. And yet, alongside the fear, a strange sense of trust had begun to root itself in her heart. Dakota's presence was a promise, unspoken but understood. She would not face this alone. The stranger at the outskirts moved closer still, pausing atop a small rise to observe the unfolding scene. Dakota noticed the subtle signals, the way the figure held their stance, the way the horse shifted beneath them. They were deliberate, measured, but their allegiance was unclear. Dakota weighed the possibilities, knowing that the right or wrong choice could either complicate or aid the impending confrontation. Every movement carried consequences. The gang leader's frustration grew. He stepped forward, signaling more aggressively to his men. They began to encircle the inn fully, cutting off any obvious escape routes. Dakota adjusted his position, his mind racing through options, contingencies, and fallback plans. He had protected towns before, fought outlaws in desert and canyon alike, but the stakes had never felt so personal. The widow's life, the survival of Red Willow, and the unknown element of the stranger made each decision critical. Ilara's breath came fast as she watched shadows move in the streets. She felt the pulse of tension, the rhythm of danger, and the strange excitement of being at the center of a life-and-death battle. She realized that she had begun to rely on Dakota in ways that went beyond simple survival. There was a connection forming, subtle and fragile, that neither could acknowledge openly in the chaos of the moment, yet it was undeniably present. Dakota's eyes swept across the inn's surroundings, noting every corner, every shadow, every possible angle of attack. He had predicted the gang's movements so far, yet the presence of the stranger complicated the situation. One misstep could cost them everything. The sun climbed higher, and with it the heat of tension pressed down, making every movement sharper, every decision weighty. Suddenly, one of the gang's men attempted to slip toward the rear of the inn, taking advantage of a small shadow. Dakota moved instantly, his presence unseen, intercepting silently, forcing the man back into the open with a warning strike. The sound echoed through the town, a small but significant victory. The gang leader's eyes flicked toward the disturbance, narrowing. The real confrontation was approaching. Inside, Ilara pressed herself close to the window, watching silently. She had learned patience, observation, and control, but nothing could prepare her for the direct, living intensity of combat outside. She saw Dakota's movements, the precision, the calm fury that carried him through danger. Each action was deliberate, measured, and necessary. Her admiration grew alongside fear, mingling with the stirrings of emotions she had long denied. The stranger finally moved closer, dismounting near the edge of town. Dakota watched silently, analyzing every detail. The figure was deliberate, controlled, and alert. Dakota could not yet discern ally or threat, but their presence added a new layer to the already tense situation. Every second now was a test of patience, skill, and judgment. The gang's impatience reached a boiling point. The leader signaled for a full assault, his cruelty and frustration evident in every movement. They were about to converge, and the moment of maximum danger had arrived. Dakota braced, arrows ready, muscles coiled, eyes scanning every angle. Ilara, inside, braced with him, heart racing, body tense. And then a figure emerged from the shadows, distinct from both Dakota and the gang, a presence that could tip the balance of the battle. The stranger's intentions were still unknown, but the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Red Willow held its breath. The widow and the warrior faced the greatest test of their courage, skill, and trust yet. Every shadow, every whisper, every movement now mattered. The first strike, the first confrontation, the first moment of chaos was imminent. Dakota's senses burned with anticipation, and Ilara's heart pounded with a mixture of fear, hope, and something unspoken that bound them together. The climax of danger had arrived, the moment before resolution, and the town itself seemed to tremble under the weight of what was about to unfold. The wind shifted, carrying faint whispers from the gang and the unknown rider. Dakota's eyes narrowed, muscles tensed, and his bow was ready. Ilara clutched her locket, holding on not just to memory but to courage. The shadows pressed closer, the unknown element moved into position, and the story of the tough Apache and the gentle widow reached its moment of highest tension. Every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of movement mattered now. The conflict had grown to its fullest, the danger most intense, and the anticipation unbearable. Red Willow was poised on the edge of violence and revelation, with the lives of the widow, the warrior, and the town hanging in balance. The story waited, breathless, on the precipice, for the moment when courage, skill, and trust would collide with danger in ways that could change everything. Dakota's arrow flew silently through the morning air, striking the first of the gang's men squarely in the shoulder, and the shot rang like a bell of warning across Red Willow. The man stumbled, cursing, drawing attention from his companions, and in that brief chaos, Dakota moved like a shadow, striking another who tried to flank the inn from the rear. Every motion was precise, calculated, and deadly. The gang, trained to intimidate and overwhelm, now found themselves disrupted, their careful plans unraveling under the Apache warrior's skill and determination. Ilara pressed herself against the wall of the inn, her heart hammering. Yet her fear had begun to mix with something else: admiration. She watched Dakota's movements, the way he controlled the battlefield with patience and precision, and felt the stirrings of hope that life could still hold moments of courage and triumph. Her hand gripped the locket, but this time it was not just for comfort, it was a talisman of endurance, a reminder that she had survived and could face more than she ever imagined. The gang leader, a broad-shouldered man with cruel eyes, realized that the fight was no longer going to be simple. His men were faltering under Dakota's relentless vigilance. He roared orders, trying to regain control, but each command was met with hesitation. Fear had begun to creep into their ranks, and inexperience or uncertainty could be as dangerous as skill. Dakota noticed the change immediately and used it to his advantage, knocking another arrow, sending it in a path that forced the leader to retreat, his expression twisting in anger. From the outskirts, the stranger had finally entered the town, moving with deliberate steps toward the inn. Dakota's eyes narrowed, measuring the intentions of this unknown figure. The rider dismounted, revealing a presence both commanding and cautious. Dakota did not lower his bow but recognized the timing of their approach. It was not aggression but observation, a potential ally who could tip the balance at the right moment. Inside, Ilara felt the tension of the morning shift in subtle ways. She could see the struggle unfolding, could feel the rhythm of battle, and realized that survival depended on coordination and trust, not just courage. Dakota had trained her to notice, to remain quiet, to observe the small details, and she had absorbed it. Her hands no longer trembled. Her senses were sharp. She was ready to face what came next. The gang leader, seeing his men falter, made a desperate move. He surged forward, attempting to push Dakota back and break through the inn's defenses. Dakota met him without hesitation, moving with fluid precision, blocking the first strike, deflecting the second, and in a single motion, disarming the man. The gang leader's surprise was complete, and the hesitation that followed was all Dakota needed. He drove the man back, forcing him to yield ground while keeping the line of attack controlled. The unknown rider stepped closer now, and Dakota allowed a brief glance. The figure moved with purpose, eyes sharp, ready to assist without disrupting the delicate balance of the fight. Together, though unspoken, they created a triangle of defense and offense, pushing back the gang with skill, determination, and a sense of calm authority. The gang's momentum was broken. Fear had begun to dominate them, making mistakes and miscalculations more frequent. Ilara's heart raced, but she felt a new sense of calm. The fight was still dangerous, yet she could see the turning of tides. Dakota's strategy, his skill, and the unexpected aid of the stranger had begun to dismantle the threat methodically. She allowed herself to breathe, but only lightly, for she knew the danger was not entirely over. One of the gang's men tried to flee, but the stranger intercepted him, forcing him back toward his companions, and Dakota moved to capitalize on the confusion. Arrows and well-placed movements corralled the remaining outlaws, leaving the leader exposed and alone. The confrontation had reached its peak, and the balance of power had shifted decisively. The gang leader glared, his anger raw, but he understood the inevitability of defeat. His attempts to command or intimidate fell flat. Dakota approached him steadily, eyes unwavering, and the leader finally dropped his weapon, defeated. The rest of the gang fled, some stumbling, some running, but all broken by the precision, patience, and courage that had defended the widow and the town. Ilara exhaled, relief flooding through her body. The threat that had loomed over Red Willow for hours had been neutralized. She stepped cautiously to the doorway, meeting Dakota's steady gaze. Her gratitude was evident, yet the quiet, unspoken connection between them carried something deeper. Survival had forged not only safety but trust, respect, and the possibility of something more. Dakota lowered his bow but remained alert, scanning the streets to ensure the last of the threat had disappeared. The town was quiet now, save for the rustling of wind and distant calls from townsfolk emerging cautiously from hiding. Red Willow had survived the storm, but it had been a test of endurance, skill, and courage for everyone involved. The stranger approached Dakota and Ilara, revealing a calm, measured demeanor. There was no aggression, only the quiet assurance that they had observed and, if necessary, would intervene further. Dakota nodded subtly, acknowledging the support without breaking focus. The tension of unknown variables had passed, and a sense of order began to settle over the town once more. Ilara moved closer to Dakota, her hands still shaking slightly, though the adrenaline had faded. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice carrying both awe and relief. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Dakota allowed a small, rare smile, the first in hours. "You were never alone," he replied. "I was here because it mattered, because your life matters. And because fear is easier to face with someone beside you," his words, simple yet powerful, resonated with her, weaving together the strands of trust, courage, and the beginnings of hope. The townsfolk began to emerge fully now, watching the aftermath with wary relief. They had seen Dakota's skill, the way he protected Ilara, and the way the fight had been resolved without needless bloodshed. Whispers of gratitude spread quickly, a quiet recognition that their town had survived through vigilance, bravery, and careful strategy. Ilara turned to Dakota once more, and the tension that had gripped her all night melted into something softer. The fear remained in memory, a reminder of fragility, but it no longer dominated her thoughts. There was a sense of accomplishment, relief, and even a budding admiration for the man who had placed himself in danger for her. She realized that strength could come in many forms: courage, skill, and the quiet steadiness of someone who refused to falter when stakes were highest. Dakota surveyed Red Willow, noting the marks of the night, the disturbed dirt, the scattered objects, the subtle signs of struggle. Everything told a story of tension, fear, and the resilience of those who had survived. He allowed himself a moment of reflection. The fight had tested him, tested Ilara, and tested the town itself. And through it all, patience, observation, and courage had prevailed. The stranger, who had watched from the outskirts, nodded slightly to Dakota and then turned to leave, understanding that their role in this conflict was complete. Dakota watched them go, aware that Red Willow had been protected not by chance but through the coordination of careful actions and vigilant allies. The presence of the unknown rider had been a variable, yes, but one that reinforced the importance of trust, strategy, and courage in times of danger. Ilara stepped outside fully now, the morning sun warming her face. She looked at the streets, the buildings, the subtle scars of the night's struggle, and felt a quiet sense of triumph. Dakota joined her, his expression calm yet attentive, aware that the resolution of one battle did not erase the memories or the lessons learned. She reached out, tentatively, placing a hand on his arm. The simple gesture spoke volumes: gratitude, trust, and a connection forged in adversity. The town slowly returned to life. Shopkeepers began to open doors, children peered cautiously from behind walls, and the subtle sounds of daily life returned. Yet beneath the surface, Red Willow had changed. It had survived, but it had also witnessed courage, resilience, and the importance of standing together in the face of danger. The widow and the warrior had endured the night and emerged not just alive but strengthened, their bond quietly solidified. Dakota and Ilara walked along the main street, moving carefully yet confidently. The danger had passed, but the lessons of the night lingered. Courage, patience, and trust had been tested and proven. Fear had been faced and overcome. And through it all, a subtle, unspoken connection had formed, one that promised safety. companionship, and perhaps even the beginnings of something more? The town of Red Willow breathed again, but the story of the tough Apache and the gentle widow would linger in memory and conversation. A tale of danger survived, lessons learned, and courage honored. Dakota remained vigilant, of course, but now with a sense of accomplishment and quiet satisfaction. Ilara, once consumed by fear and grief, felt the stirrings of hope and strength that only experience and survival could bring. The sun climbed fully into the sky, washing the town in light, and for the first time in a long night, there was peace. The gang had fled, the threat had ended, and the widow and her protector had endured. In that quiet triumph, Red Willow had witnessed the strength of human courage, the power of trust, and the resilience of those willing to fight for what mattered. Dakota and Ilara stood side by side, looking over the town, their breaths mingling with the warmth of morning. The danger was over, but the bond formed in the crucible of survival remained. Words were unnecessary. Their understanding was enough. The night had been a trial, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and closer. The Apache warrior and the gentle widow had faced fear, darkness, and uncertainty, and in doing so, had discovered the quiet triumph of courage, trust, and human connection. Red Willow continued its slow return to normalcy. Life would resume, but the memory of the night, the courage displayed, and the unwavering presence of the warrior would linger. For Ilara, the experience had transformed fear into respect, grief into hope, and isolation into trust. For Dakota, the night had reinforced the value of vigilance, skill, and the quiet satisfaction of fulfilling a promise to protect. Together they had endured, survived, and discovered that even in the harshest moments, the human spirit and connection could prevail. And as the morning sun bathed Red Willow in light, the story of the tough Apache and the gentle widow reached its natural, satisfying conclusion. Danger had been faced, fear had been challenged, and courage had been rewarded. Life could continue, hope could grow, and the bond formed in the crucible of conflict remained strong, quietly promising new beginnings in a world that had once seemed so perilous. The town would remember the night of terror, but more importantly, it would remember the strength, resilience, and heart of two people who had faced it together and survived.